Hi everyone, this is Marina from Frocks Frolics and we'll continue on with more doll clothes for you. In this video I'm going to show you how to make the Paris jacket. You might have made it for your daughter already, and this version here is quite a lot easier, but what you can learn with it as well is of course how to put a shawl collar in, which wraps all the way around. It's absolutely gorgeous. It's just like the girl's jacket. I have simplified it a little bit so that no beginner has to worry about that. I think it's a great practice ground for you. And on this side we've got another beautiful doll which is wearing the Audrey capris, just like this one. She can sit this one out because we've got them here as well, and that's part of the combination that you get. They come as a package. You get the jacket and you get the pants together. And everyone that purchases right now, before I've brought all of them out, I'm going to do a package every month. So at the end of the summer we are going to have a package which is all the extras like little hats and tops and all sorts, and if you buy now you get that for free added to your course at the end. If you wait to the end, then well, you just have to purchase it if you want it. But without further ado, let's crack on here with a Paris jacket. This jacket comes with 3/4 or full-length sleeves with a ruffle. If you want no ruffles, you need to make the pattern 2 centimeters longer, but apart from that, that's fine. I've put a ruffle on the bottom here as well. You could leave that ruffle off too. That's absolutely no problem. Same method. And I'm using cam snaps to close it, but as you will see in a minute, I put the markings on for the buttonholes so that you can put one in if you want to. I don't think it's necessary, and you've got all the little details that the girl's jacket had as well. And I want to encourage you to try this because it's such good practice. And if you're a little bit scared of making a collar like that, well, make it for the doll. If it doesn't turn out perfect, you can practice there, and I'm sure nobody's going to look too closely at the doll clothes. First, we're going to look at the pattern pieces now. I've prepared it all for you, cut it all out. So let's see what you need to cut out in order to make this jacket. We're going to look at the pattern first, so we make sure that all the right stuff's cut out. So starting with the sleeve, I've got that here twice, and then I've got the ruffle that goes on the lower end twice as well. That's cut on the fold, and the sleeve is cut mirror image. Make sure that you mark the front and the sleeve head. That makes it easier to put it in later. The back lining has a facing, lining, and then another facing. And they're going to be sewn together to make one piece like we have here in the upper material. That's the back. And you could cut that on the fold, but I personally think it's nicer for these smaller pieces if you've got it in one bit. It's easier to cut out as well. So I'm doing it like that. And then you also need to mark here the center back for all of that. It makes it easier later on. On the front pattern, I have marked the welt buttonhole. You could of course put any buttonhole in you like, and there is a video in the course that will show you how to do a welt buttonhole, which you can then do with a really beautiful button like the proper sized jacket, so that you get a good practice in, but you don't have to do it. Now I'm cutting the front 4 times. I use the same materials, so the same material rolls to the outside. It's basically the inner collar or the facing, or even the lining of the front, however you want to say it. And then on all 4 pieces, we want to make sure that we strengthen the area we are going to snip later. So you need to put a little bit of interfacing in that position. And then let's just have a quick look here at my ruffles. I cut the ruffles for the sleeve twice, of course, and then they're just going to be reduced to fit onto that hem. And then I've got another frill or ruffle for the jacket hem. And that's it basically. Let's get started with the back. We're just putting it first in front of us exactly how we want it to look when it's finished, and then we just flip over the lower facing onto the lining, and we're going to put that together. You don't need more than just the 1 pin really, just put 1 in on the center back so that they line up, and then we can just put oh, there, the pin goes in that way, makes it easier to see. We can put it like that, and you can see how beautiful that will be. Now we're going to close the shoulder seams for the lining and for the upper material. So all you need to do is put the shoulders of the back on top here of the front, and then the collar will kind of wrap around there. So fold it over. I find that easiest to do. You mark the seam allowance on the collar and right into the shoulder seam. And then what we're going to do, once we've put the shoulders on top of each other, just put a pin through, and you will see that that ends 1 centimeter of the neckline of the back. So all you have to do is line up your shoulder seam and then just sew from or to that point that you've marked with your textile marker. So let's do this again. Mark the seam allowance. And by that dot, we're going to start or stop. In this case, we're going to stop right there and pin it. Really isn't that hard. Now let's put this to the side. Do the same again on the lining. Just plonk your front piece onto the back piece, mark your seam allowance, and then put a pin in there. Really is simple if your fabric is very stable. And that, I think, is the key to it. And because the distances are very small, you can't really go wrong as you can with the full-sized girls jacket. So this is not only easier, but it's also very good practice. And once you know how it works, you go, ah, that's okay, I can do it for the girls jacket as well. Now I've already put together the upper part here. Now I'm going to sew the lower facing onto the lining as well. And as always, my seam allowance is always 1 centimeter or 5/8 of an inch. And just go over to the other side. I cut that a bit shorter because actually it's a bit blurry, that footage. As you can see, my hands are perfectly sharp and then the foot is blurry. So once we've done that, we are going to top stitch the seam allowance to the body center. That means the lower one is facing up and the upper one is facing down. And when you do the top stitching, you should always use a longer stitch length. I'm using stitch length 3 or even 3.5. I mean, if you do 2.5, doesn't really matter, but I think it looks nicer if it's like a bigger stitch length. And that concludes the lining here. And now I'm going to close those shoulder seams. And as you can see here, I will go forwards a couple of stitches. I've also reduced the stitch length to 1.5. And then I go exactly that amount of stitches backwards and forwards again. And then you can lengthen the stitch length and go to the end. You can also just stitch it with stitch length 2.5. That's also good. So now I'm approaching it again. I put down my stitch length, 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches. Press the reverse button and go 1, 2, 3, 4. Reverse button again, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so by counting it like a little child, it actually works really well. As you can see, it goes exactly to the right point. Nothing to it. I do the same on the other side. That's it. Reverse your stitches. And then we're ready to close the collar, and that's just done with a centimeter. Of course, for everyone following me along, you can do that straight on the sewing machine. There is absolutely no reason why you need to go back to your table or anything. You can just do that on the sewing machine. Close the back of your collar on both. And what you should get in the habit of is just take the next one, put it right next to it, just under, so you're saving yourself a little bit of thread. Reverse your stitches. There we go. Now it gets interesting. You can see here I've ironed my seam allowances of the shoulders and the collar already apart. Now this collar is a shawl collar, which means that it rolls around like a shawl. And in order to do that, you need to snip rigorously here right to that point. Don't be scared. It's really important you do that well. Don't stop before the point. You need to go right into that corner. And then we're going to put the center back and the center of my collar on top of each other. And then really pull this out here. Open it all out. And then you also need to pull out your front piece and just move it round like that. And when you open it out like that, it will fit perfectly. That's really simple then. And we're going to start from that point where we've got the cut, and we're going to sew all the way across. So do the same on the other side. Really give it a good tuck. Move out the front piece so it's nice and flat in front of you, and put a pin in. Right, let's do this again, because I think that's probably what most people will find a bit scary. So I'm cutting exactly to the point again. Give it a good tuck. Put the center back and the collar seam on top of each other. Yeah, open it all out nicely. Make sure that the rough edges sit on top of each other. And again, fold out that front piece so it's not in the way and it sits perfectly flat. Awesome. Look at that. Now all we have to do is close that, starting exactly at the point where we've cut it. And we go to the other side. And I'm sorry, my fingers are a little bit in the way here. But I think you get the idea. Looks beautiful. Now we're going to iron that neck seam into the collar and not downwards. You could do one downwards, one into the collar. But to be honest, for a doll clothes, you want the collar to stand as well. And because of short distances, it makes more sense to just iron it into the top. And that's that part done already. Whoa. Now I quickly want to show you something, just in case you want to do a Velcro closure instead of cam snaps or a buttonhole and you don't want the stitching to be seen on the outside. If you put the pieces together like this, so you know which one is the underside, so you can't get confused, and then you cut yourself that hook and loop tape or Velcro, and you open it out, and we are looking for the soft side here. Soft side is on the underside of the front. There we go. And we're going to sew that just to the lining, and that needs to be 1.2 centimeters from both the front edge and the hem, so that doesn't get caught in the seam allowance, because Velcro tends to be quite thick. And we would sew all the way around, and then the other part we sew on when we're done. Now I'm not going to do that, so I'm going to take this back off. This is just a tip for everyone that wants to use Velcro. The next thing we're going to do is to close that front, and we're going to go, as you can see, once all the way around. It's really simple. So pop over onto the sewing machine and sew it together to that point. This is a little bit different to what I was showing you in the original course, because we didn't put a ruffle in there. That was a separate video for the ruffle. Here we're just doing like ruffle it. So I'm going to sew all the way around, and when I get to the corners, I'm going to put the stitch length down. It's not necessary actually, because I'm not going to cut this back rigorously, but all of you that want to cut this back, then you need to reduce the stitch length to 1.5 and then lengthen it again. That makes really good sense. You could just leave it at 2.5, because we're going to fold the edges over each other and turn it instead of cutting it off. It actually is giving you a much neater edge, and you'll see that in a minute. So you don't necessarily need to do that, but as a rule, I think it's a very good habit to get into, to have the stitch length smaller wherever you have these really tight corners, or you have somewhere where you're probably going to trim it back. There we go. And back down on the other side. Now we want to cut back our seam allowance a little bit, but in this area we're going to fold it before we turn it, okay? And then we want to cut the seam allowance back, and we're cutting the lining seam allowance back and leaving the seam allowance from the upper material standing. And I work my way all the way around. And then the next thing we need to do is to snip any curves so that there is no tension when we turn it. Right to the seam. You can also cut that back a little bit so that you don't have that much left standing in there, but again, you could just leave that standing. There we go. I'm just cutting a little bit off. I'm thinking, well, that's a bit overkill here in the curve. We don't need a centimeter standing. There we are. So now we're going to fold inwards, one seam allowance over the other, and then I hold that here with my finger, and then I press it through into the corner, and that gives you a really, really perfect corner. Look at that. Very nice, right? You don't really get that when you cut across the corner, especially if you have very stable fabrics like this. It tends to give you a little nose and it looks rather homemade and unprofessional, so you don't want that. And you could now press this as well and make sure that it lies nice and flat. Next, we're going to do all our sleeves. So here we've got the ruffles. So you can see I've put in gather threads in the top edge and just ironed my ruffle in half. And hang on, here we go. Just fold it over, iron it lengthways in half, and then add the gather threads to the top edge. And here we have to close that shorter seam first, and then we turn it, iron it lengthways in half, and then add our gather threads. So let's put in gather threads. Here what I'm going to do is I'm actually locking in the stitches on the one side, go to the other side close to the edge, leave a long thread hanging, and then I do another line foot width next to that, and I do exactly the same. I lock in my stitches. There we go. And then I go to the other side, and that way I don't have to fix the stitches in a minute when I put them to my hem of the sleeve. It's just quicker. And for my ruffle for the hem, I have the right sides on the inside. I folded the shorter side over and I sew it shut. You can cut that back if you like it. And then you're going to also put the gather stitches in there. Now let's put the ruffle onto the sleeve, and you've got the side where obviously you have got the stitches locked in. So from the other side you want to pull the bobbin threads until the ruffle fits onto your sleeve. And you put a vertical pin in there, and then you just wrap your thread around in a figure of 8. And then you can move the ruffles right close to that. But just remember, you have got that centimeter seam allowance that does not need any ruffling in it. So stop shy of the seam allowance, please, with your ruffles. Distribute them. Lovely. And that's what we're going to sew in now. Onto the sewing machine. Stitch length 2.5, and you can do this foot width. You do not need a centimeter here. It really doesn't make any odds at all. And you're sewing between your gathering stitches. Plonk that in, and then the next step is to serge that edge real neatly, and you do that from the underside of your fabric. And then the next step is to top stitch that seam into the sleeve. Again, we want a stitch length then of 3.5. It's always nicer if it's a little bit longer. You do that on both sleeves, of course. And then we're going to put a gather thread 1 centimeter from the edge into the head of the sleeve so that we can pull that. It just makes it easier to put the sleeve in. I don't actually think it needed it very much, to be honest, but that's up to you. If you think it needs it, you can do that just to get into the habit. And what this also does when you do like a proper jacket for yourself, it'll create a little bit of a round there to begin with. Now we're going to put the sleeves into the jacket, and what you want to do is find the front and then the front snip. And now all I have to do is fold that over, stick that in here, pin it on. So you pin on one end, and then you take that snip for the sleeve head and align that with the shoulder seam and put a pin in there, and then you're just fitting it to that armhole. It's actually nothing, there's nothing to it really. You just want to make sure that you round into the armhole rather than over it. It's always good if the sleeve is held in a little bit, but here it's not really that much. In fact, after I've done the video, I reduced that width of the sleeve a little bit, and it really goes in fairly flat. That said, please, if you think that you need it and you have trouble putting sleeves in, it's such a good habit to do, just to put that thread over the sleeve head and then pull it a bit, or even steam it in before you start work, and you get this beautiful sleeve that really sits and rolls over the shoulder. So, and you can see here when I put the seam allowance into the sleeve, I'm going to just do that here with my fingers, how beautiful that will then sit and roll over. So test your sleeve, although I mean it is a doll's jacket, so if it's not quite right, it's okay as well. If there are a few gathers in there, it wouldn't matter too much. So now I'm going to put that in, and again you can just do foot width seam allowance here. The 1 centimeter is allowed for, but not necessary. If you think that it's easier for you to put it in foot width, then please go ahead and do that. I take the pin out just as I get to it, and then I use it to hold the fabric down so none of it can push or shove. Very important to always make sure that the underneath is also flat, because you can get pleats in there, and that you keep moving it so it's fed in straight to your presser foot as you go. There you go. There's another little bit that I need to hold a little bit, and there we go. Next one, just keep holding it with your pin. Something that I do with any sleeve I put in, really. It works really well, because then as you go, it doesn't start pleating to, you know, pushing the fabric to get that pleat lower down. You need to make sure that that doesn't happen, and you can just do that so easy by just holding it with that pin while you're sewing. And then the next step here is to serge that edge, and now we're going to close the seam. So the underarm seam needs to be sitting on top of each other. There we go. Put a pin in there, and then I put a pin vertical to the seam at the end, because it's very likely that it will try to push that out, and then you have like that really horrid little step which you don't want. So I always put a pin vertical to the seam there, and you do the same on the other side. There you go, underarm seam. Make sure these sit exactly on top of each other there, the edges. Brilliant. And then I can go to the sewing machine and sew those in one go. So you sew from the start of the ruffle all the way down to the hem, and from the hem all the way up to the ruffle. And then you serge that edge. And now we're going to pull away the gather threads, or the serger threads. So what you need is a needle with quite a big eye, so that you can put the threads through that. First you pull on them to make sure that you first you pull on it so that they're nice and flat, and then you put the two ends that will stand out through your needle, and that will pull the other part through it as well. There we go, over. So now I'm going into that seam allowance and I'm just going to pull it through. That gives you a really nice finish. Push it through and you can cut it off, and then you can iron that seam towards the center back. Brilliant. Snip. Now, I haven't done this in the instructions, but I think it would be really worthwhile to put a holding stitch foot width all the way around the armhole before you now close the side seam of the lining as well, because we're going to snip that lining and turn that seam allowance in to make it all neat. So that is a bit difficult if you haven't put this holding stitch in. Brilliant. So we're almost done. All we need to do now is to put the ruffle on the hem. So take your ruffle and ruffle it so it fits just onto the upper material here, from the front to the other front. It's exactly the same as we did with our sleeves, and then I go over to the sewing machine and I can stitch that lot in. And now we want to just sew between those two gather stitching lines. Move the pins out as you go along and adjust your gathers as needed. Interesting, because we're going to do this thing that some people call bagging. We're going to just stick everything inside. Looks really good, right? So that's brilliant. Now we're going to close the hem perfectly, and in this example I've taken the gather threads out at this point. You can also take them out when you are done, and you only need to take the gather thread out that is visible at the end anyway. The rest of them you always leave them in. So now I'm going to do that bagging I've just alluded to. So stick everything in once you've checked it. That's beautiful. There you go. Stick it in. Line up your side seams and pin those together. And then of course center front, you want your ruffle to sit right in that front bit. And you can now sew together either from the side or pin it from the side as well that you've already sewn, and then you can sew it together on exactly the same stitching line or just below it. What you don't want is a stitching line to be visible when you're finished. So whichever side you do it from, you need to be slightly further over than you were. So if you sewn it on with foot width seam allowance, you now want to do it with centimeter seam allowance, or you want to stitch exactly on that line you've already had. Now I'm stitching with 1 centimeter seam allowance here, and I'm stitching from the side that doesn't have that other line on it. Both is completely fine. I think that on my other example for the girls ruffle hem, where I show that, I actually do it from the other side if I remember rightly. So both is perfectly okay, and you can watch all these videos to help you learn all the different methods that there are. So do have a look at the other videos that I've made available in this store course as well. Awesomeness. So now all we have to do is cut back all our seam allowances, make sure that is really nice and flat, and we're coming to the end. It's brilliant. And there's one. And I can cut back my lining again so that it's not quite so thick, because we do have the 2 layers plus the ruffle, so it's quite nice when you do that. Now we want to turn our little jacket, and we turn it through one of the armholes. And then if you wanted to, you could give it a really good press all the way around, and you could also top stitch all the way around if you wanted to. I didn't think with this busy fabric and it being like more like a finer jacket, not so sporty, that it needed it. But if it was, say, in jeans, I probably would top stitch it, or even do 2 top stitching lines next to each other, so it looks really sporty. Now we're going to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. So before we snip all the way around the armhole, what we want to do is pin all the way around and make sure that everything sits really smoothly. And that looks quite good. Now you can see now why that holding stitch is so important, because if now all you needed to do is snip right to that stitching line of that holding stitch I've asked you to put in earlier, then it would be much easier. And as a beginner, I think it's quite easy to cut too far or not far enough. And then all you have to do is turn in the seam allowance and pin it all the way around, and then we're going to slip stitch it. I think that's a really nice way to finish it. Sometimes people don't like using hand stitching on something like this, but I thought that this is probably the quickest and easiest way, and it also looks really nice, because we do want it to make this a little bit easier than the girl's jacket. So when you watch both of them, or you have both of them, you will realize the difference. And maybe some of you will say, well, I use these instructions from now on because actually I understand how it works and this is simpler. So the girls version has much more for you to learn in terms of methods and how to sew something. This is really a quite quick version here, but I think it's helpful for all, for beginners and for those that already know how to do all this. So now I need to get myself a sewing needle and put a knot in the end, and then all I do is what I call tunneling through. I go through that fold that we have, and then I catch a little bit of the sleeve seam allowance and secure my thread there, and I do that. I go all the way around. That makes it look really nice. Look at that, beautiful. So we're almost done. All we have to do now is to put the closure on, and in my case I decided to put some cam snaps on, so the jacket needs to overlap 1.5 centimeters in the front, and I've already put that on. Of course, that first one, the key is to mark where you want them to go, and then using the owl you push through all the layers so that the snaps will all line up afterwards. Remove the lower layer from the owl and place your cap snap under the yoke. Push the prong through to the top. Then you place the socket on top of that prong and place the snaps between the top and bottom dies of your pliers. Then you press down and release, and then you can see the prong has been flattened. And then I can lift out the owl completely and I can do the other one. Then this time we're going to put the slim rim on, which is called a stud, and again we're going to put it between the pliers and press down, and when we released it we have got the cam snap securely fastened. And that's it, your jacket is finished. I hope you enjoyed watching and you join me again for another video on the doll clothes collection. I personally really enjoy making these because they are quicker than the girls' stuff and they look just gorgeous. So if your daughter or granddaughter or friend's daughter or anyone really has one of these dolls, then yeah, go for it. If you want to learn how to sew, I think this is a great training ground. So if you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and you can get all the patterns, of course, at frocksandfrolics.com. If you get your pattern now and you add it to the course, at the end of the summer, you will get the package with all the hats and the extras that I'm doing for it, which you will see throughout the summer already added to, like here, this gorgeous little top and that hat. You will get all those patterns at the end for free. So I hope to see you soon again for another video where I'm going to show you how to make more dolls' clothes. Bye for now.